Hey, who wants to rebuild a carburetor? Hey everybody, welcome to Lost Wrench Garage. I'm Scott. This video is kind of a spin-off of the last video. If you didn't see the last video, check it out. It is epic. And by epic, I mean it's long. It was almost an hour and a half long, and because of that, I wasn't able to include a lot of stuff that I spent a lot of time on. And one of those things was the carburetor rebuild. In the last video, you just saw about a 1-minute time lapse of putting that carburetor back together and an abbreviated version of the disassembly. So I thought it would be nice to include some content on a complete rebuild of the carburetor, and that's what we're going to do today. So why did we rebuild this carburetor? Well, when we went to start the car, which was the subject of the last video, we turned the fuel supply onto the carburetor and it all just leaked out the bottom. So we pulled the carburetor with the purpose of rebuilding it. Now, could we have just checked out the needle and seat where the problem probably was? Probably so, but I'm glad that we rebuilt the whole carburetor because we did find a few other problems along the way that we were able to address in the course of the rebuild. I'm also going to do a little testing and experimentation on the carburetor, mostly for me to learn how the carburetor works, and you'll see some of that. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my former self, who's going to take you through the rebuild. I'll see you on the other side.
I put it in this bucket here because we know this fuel bowl is full of fuel. Eventually that's going to come out of there. Pretty soon here actually as we take it apart. But the way to think of this carburetor and any carburetor, and I just say stuff, I don't know what I'm talking about, but it helps me kind of think through things. But basically a carburetor is a fuel supply that sits between a choke and a throttle plate. And the choke restricts air, usually for situations where the air is cold or the engine is cold. And the throttle just regulates the engine speed. So those are situated with the fuel supply in between, usually through a venturi. And this fuel bowl here is basically like a little mini gas tank. You know, you got your big gas tank, and then it delivers fuel to this little gas tank so that the carburetor can meter out the fuel with precision. So with this carburetor, the first thing we're going to do is just take this fuel bowl cover off. This is a Carter YH. These carburetors were used on Corvairs, but also the early first generation Corvettes, 53 through 55, I think, that used a 6-cylinder engine. And I think in a lot of those cars, they had a triple Carter carburetor setup. So 3 of these. We've got one, but we've also got a turbo. So I think in this carburetor, from what I can tell, the float is connected to the cover, so it comes out with the cover. So there's the float right there. It actually looks pretty good. Doesn't look too gunked up in there. I believe this is the accelerator pump right here. So that there are periods of heavy acceleration. You actually pump fuel in rather than just have it aspirated in. This is the float that closes off the needle in its seat. The Ford Mustang I have has an Autolite 2100, and it forces the needle down. This actually forces it up. That's kind of interesting. So that comes out of there. That needle actually looks pretty good. This all looks pretty good. Okay, so we got the fuel out of there. Try to decide what next is. So it looks like what we need to do, we're going to have to remove the connection here. So that's a little cotter pin.
Okay, I'm going to stop right there and talk about what I should have done at this point. The accelerator pump and metering rod assembly that you see there really best comes out as a unit, but I didn't know that. What I should have done was simply loosen the little screw that retains the throttle linkage, and then take out the 4 screws at the base of the accelerator pump, and that whole thing would have come out as a unit much easier. Instead, I sort of take this apart piecemeal, which I cannot recommend.
So that spring is situated in there. It probably needs to come out. There we go. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. And it'll just come right out, right? No, because it's attached to the throttle linkage. So looks like we'll have to turn our attention to the throttle body, throttle linkage. So let's do that. Get this off of here. Might have to be turned to a certain position in order to come out. Looks like it's got, this spot there. Take that out, and then we can take the throttle body off. This out here while we're in it. Two gaskets in there. Sort of held in there with little staples or something, it looks like. So that comes out of there, and that's the throttle body. So this should come out now. And then we can remove the accelerator pump. Accelerator pump diaphragm there. So this will, in theory, move in and out. I think this diaphragm has gotten really stiff. And that's what happens with these accelerator pump diaphragms. So we'll work on that. Should come in the kit as a replacement. We'll have to get that old one off. This is a little divider here. And then next we'll get this plug out. This is the thing that has a little check ball in it. There's a spring in there. There it goes. The ball bearing. Okay. And finally the jet. Now this you don't want to damage, so it does appear this screwdriver fits about perfect on there. You wouldn't want to use a blade that was a little too small, but that's coming right out real nice. I assume that's brass, so it's probably soft, so it could be damaged if you really weren't careful with it. So jet, these usually have a number on it. Let's see what it says on there. 120 it looks like. So it's looking to show there's different sizes. A lot of times different sizes you can use, and depending on what altitude you're at and various things like that. All right, let's take this automatic choke cover off. I think one of them's not original because it's a Phillips. Everything else has been flatheads, I've noticed in this. So that's got a little, these all have like little retainer pieces on there. That's what puts the tension up against the automatic choke housing to hold it in the proper spring position tension. You can adjust that, clean or rich. So there's your spring. Now this is interesting. This still has this gasket. I noticed that I have that old rebuild kit that came in the car. It's not really useful. It's, whoa, that's a little magnetic. But it did have, or the new kits come with a gasket that looks a little bit like this. But this is like paper thin. I just sort of suspect this is an original gasket on here. I don't know. Maybe somebody knows. Interesting pattern on there. And this has a little cover plate on it. You know, but basically the way this works is a bimetallic spring expands with heat, and that adjusts the position of the, adjusts the position of the choke plate. So under cold conditions, you restrict the airflow, suck more fuel in, less air, richer mixture. And then as it warms up, this opens up the action of that spring on there, just expanding and pulling on this tab here. That's how that works. But I feel like I've got to get in there, and I wonder if this plate, yeah, it just comes right out, doesn't it? Yeah. Now this is interesting. This little piston right here, and what this does is you get a little vacuum on the other side of that piston, and it pulls it down so that if you suddenly hit the accelerator, it pulls the choke off for just a second, so that the engine's not choked when it's trying to get air and fuel. I noticed that seems to be wide open right there. So I'm going to investigate whether there's supposed to be something to cover that, or a vacuum source that's supposed to go in there. This, I think, is set the automatic choke, because this is connected throttle linkage, and it goes in and out with the action of the throttle, but I don't see how it's necessarily doing anything the way it's set up right now. So we'll have to investigate how that works. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I might hit that with something. It's coming clean. Probably do maybe a little Scotch-Brite or something. Obviously, we don't want to scratch it. Keep a nice smooth mating surface. Okay, so that's off. Let's see why it was so hard. This part right here is adherent to that. Now, since we're planning on soaking this, why don't we do that now rather than do a lot of scraping? Because I think it'll loosen up some of that material and it'll come off easier after soaking. This nut here is damaged. I don't know if I did all of that. I suspect there was already some damage to it, maybe because this thing's so firmly seated in there that, you know, you're damaging it when you're trying to get it open. And I don't want to damage it any further. I don't think it's leaking. It's a good seal, so I think we'll leave this attached. PB blaster. Got it. It should have a little filter screen in it. I think we were seeing bits of it there. Apparently a lot of times it's missing. Look at that. Is this the original screen? I don't know. While we were putting things in the basket to be soaked, I realized we didn't fully disassemble the accelerator pump. I'm going to take this clip off of there. In she goes. Spring. Okay, there we go. All right, we'll let that soak, and then again, we'll hopefully this stuff will loosen up a little bit and we can scrape it off more safely and easily afterwards. Let's see if we can ultrasonic thing going here. and they look pretty good. The carburetor parts are all clean, so let's put this thing back together. Start with the jet. Next, the accelerator pump discharge check ball, spring, and plug. Here's the ball. I'm just going to let it drop down in there. There she goes. And those two are in place. Now we'll assemble the accelerator pump. Got that little baffle in there. Line that up. Inner spring, outer spring for the top. Metering rod retainer spring. Okay, once the metering rod is in the jet there, everything is situated. Got our screws down in there. Just going to lift this up a little so we can put our throttle linkage where it needs to go while we still can lift that up. Recheck our metering rod is in the right place. Once the accelerator pump and metering rod are in place, you want to do a check where you pull this down until this metering rod linkage just mates with the accelerator pump linkage right there. And this metering rod should be just even with the top of the fuel bowl at that point. It looks like it is. Throttle body. Needs 3 gaskets. If you read, it's a great reference book, How to Identify and Rebuild Carter YH Carburetors Used on Corvair Turbocharged Engines. It's a great resource. It talks about the necessary thickness of the gasket material between the carburetor and the throttle body, which insulates the carburetor from the heat of the turbocharger. And this needs to be a little over 0.3 inches in thickness. And with a combination of new gaskets from the kit and one of the old gaskets, I'm pretty close to that with what we've got right here. So I'm going to sandwich these down on here. There's a little pin to get these positioned just right. And we'll assemble the throttle body. Make sure this thing is up and not trapped down here. Before you put the throttle body on, you need it to be up in this position. Go ahead and attach our accelerator pump linkage. Now the throttle, when you open the throttle, also actuates the accelerator pump in the fuel bowl. The choke, it has a problem. The tang here that moves the position of the choke plate is supposed to have another tang coming off of it right here. And that tang's supposed to sort of stick out in the orientation of this screwdriver right here. Lay down kind of across here. And engage this linkage so that the choke can be set by depressing the accelerator pedal. And it'll also reset the idle to fast idle. But there's nothing there to catch it. So what I need is a new choke shaft, which will include this entire assembly, including the piston. And I have that on order right now. Oh, there it is. It came. Well, let's take a look at this thing. It came from a place called California Corvairs. And it's a used part, but it's in much better condition than I expected it to be. It's pretty clean. And my research was correct. There is this tang here. But let's go ahead and work on installing this thing. The screws that were used to secure the choke plate to the choke shaft were staked at the factory. The threads were ruined. So when they came out, they couldn't be put back in. I tried cutting this one down. Still wouldn't work. So I have ordered a new set of screws from Clark's. Part number C1172. I mean, it threads is just very hard and I don't want to force it. So I could strip that. That's unfortunately not going to
work? I have to think about this one.
Well, we just don't have the right screws for the choke shaft and plate. So in the meantime, we got another part in, and this is the expansion plug for the automatic choke pull-off piston. Got that from a place called Mike's Carburetor Parts. Used them before, got a lot of stuff. And what we have to do is put one of these little thin expansion plugs right down in there, and then we've got to punch it. But we're a little obstructed in doing that, so I'm going to take this choke housing off and get that in a clamp or something so that I can punch that expansion plug on. Okay, so punching that spreads out the perimeter of it and seals it against there. That's what they call an expansion plug. So hopefully that's good. Well, I ordered some more screws. Yeah, they came in a batch of 100, but this is my last shot at trying to get a screw to work in there. These are number 348 screws, which is what these are supposed to be. And on the off chance that what Clark sent me were the wrong size, I'm going to try these. So let's give it a shot. Tightens down real nice, actually. Let's try the other one. I think we're in business. This carburetor is going to be done. Here we go. We've got the automatic choke all put back together, and I'd like to understand better how this works. So I've set up a little test rig here with, a little spring that's meant to simulate the action of the throttle return spring when the carburetor is actually installed in the car. So what I want to do is bring you in here and take a closer look at how all this works. This mechanism in here controls two things. One is the position of the choke plate, either closed, this is down here, it's closed, or open. When it's there, the choke plate is open. The other thing it controls is the idle setting. When the car is cold, you want a faster idle. So in that situation, this throttle linkage rests on the portion of the cam that slightly opens the throttle. So when the choke is closed and the car is cold, the throttle rests in a more open position. And then as the car warms up, it's allowed to return to a more distant position on this cam and be more closed and idle slower. So those are the two mechanisms. In terms of functionally how they work, we've got our bimetallic thermostatic spring here. And just to demonstrate it, kind of sits in here like this. And what it does is provides tension against the choke plate tang so that the engine vacuum either can or can't open it to a certain degree. So when the spring is cold and contracted because it expands in this direction, then it's putting tension on there, and the choke plate can only open so much. And then later, when it warms up, the engine vacuum is allowed to open the choke plate more fully. So just to demonstrate that with actual heat. Okay, so the car's warmed up. The spring has rotated. Now with engine vacuum, the choke can more fully open. So that's how that spring works. The only issue is when you install the housing, you know, what position do you put this in terms of how much tension on keeping the choke plate closed do you want so you don't over choke the engine during starting. So we'll set that using the adjustment on the choke housing. In the meantime, it's kind of cool to look at how this whole system works. A couple more things. The piston system we talked about, which we now have plugged off, is now pulled by engine vacuum. When engine vacuum increases, this pulls the piston down and that unloads the choke. It opens up the choke. So if there's a sudden demand related to engine vacuum, that opens up the choke. So that's that mechanism. And then the final mechanism we can talk about, let's say you're sitting here, the car is cold and the throttle is resting on the fast idle cam. You pull on the accelerator, you want that choke to unload under those conditions. So this portion of the linkage grabs hold of that tang that was missing on our original choke plate shaft and opens up the choke temporarily, and then it can return from the tension of the spring back to its choke position. So that's a way of unloading the choke with rapid acceleration, those two things. One thing is that there's also another spring which is hard to see, but it's the ends of it are wrapped around the choke shaft tang here, and basically what I can determine is that that functions to, let's say your car is parked and it had warmed up and it was warm and the choke was all the way open, and now it's parked and the throttle is closed and the car cools off and it's a cold day and the automatic choke housing spring starts to put pressure on here. Well, it can only put so much pressure on there. And basically, you're ready to start the car now, but the choke plate is still open. So this other spring, with the tension here, as we push on the accelerator one time, it allows it to return to the position as dictated by the tension from the choke housing spring. So I think that's pretty much how this works. It's just a matter of getting it set up right for the initial cold choke condition. So we'll work on that. One of the adjustments we have to make is a choke unloader setting. To do that, you close the throttle all the way, then you close the choke as far as you can. And then we want to measure 7/16 inch between here and the wall. So I need a little bit of a gauge. This card here should come in handy. Thanks, Mike's Carburetors. We're a little off, so we have to make an adjustment. And the place you make that adjustment is that choke unloader tang that was missing. This thing right here. We're supposed to bend it. Pretty good. Let's button it up with the automatic choke housing. We got this thing shined up pretty good, feeling smooth. Go ahead and put that on there. Nice. Fits in there real nice. Put this on there. Choke spring is going to catch that. Do a little research on how to set that. In the meantime, let's secure it on there and we can play with it. Okay. Now on to the fuel bowl lid. First thing we'll do is put the seat in. New gasket, new seat. Came with the rebuild kit. Now, once you get it pretty close, you need something really wide to span that. This is an upholstery removal tool, but also just fits down in there really nice. So I'm going to use that to tighten that up. Make sure it doesn't slip while you're doing this. All right, got that in there pretty snug. I want to overdo it, strip it, but I do want it to be snug because that could be a leaking site. All right, and this is our float. And we're going to put our needle on our float. This rebuild kit came with something that wasn't originally on there, but it's helpful. It's a little clip that'll retain the needle on the float. So keep the needle from getting stuck in the closed position. When the float drops down, it'll pull it with it. Now that's just dangling from there. We can drop it in. Put the rod back in. A couple of measurements you want to do, and I'll show those now. To set our float properly, we're going to go to our reference, and there's a table in here. Our carburetor is a 1963 later model, so we'll follow this column. And the third and the fourth item down are the float level setting and the float drop. And they're listed as 5/8 of an inch and 2 3/8 of an inch. However, there's a little footnote here, number 2, that says 3/4 inch float level setting is recommended. So we'll use a 3/4 inch float level and a 2 3/8 inch float drop. So what do those mean? Our float level is going to be measured from the base of the float cover to basically the top of the float here. This is upside down. And it's hard to tell on the camera, but we are getting right on about 3/4 of an inch there. If that were incorrect, then you would bend this portion of the float right here. You would bend that to either bend down or up to get it at the right level. Now the float drop is how far it drops down. The float level is where it rests when the fuel bowl is at its appropriate level. More or less needs to be kind of level. And when you put it at 3/4 of an inch, it is. And I think they want it to be a little lower than the spec to have a little lower fuel bowl. But you can see the needle seating at that level and then dropping out. In the float drop, it needs to be 2 3/8 inch. So just for convenience, I'm going to put this on the 10. And it is right on 2 3/8 inches there. Now, if that were off, what we'd want to do is we would want to limit the travel of the float as it drops. And there's a little tab right here. Part of the float, it sticks up there, and it impacts the seat. And if you bend it forward or back, it'll impact that seat in a different position, and you'll have more or less float drop. So I think we're set up pretty good, but I do want to do some things to test it out. In order to test this out, make sure needle's holding properly. We're first going to close off the top of the fuel inlet. It's got this little cap that goes on there. It's got a little gasket that came in the rebuild kit. So we're going to slide that on there. And what we can do is take this little rubber tip air compressor accessory, put this upside down so that the weight of the float is seating the needle. If we put this in here and blow air in there, then no air should pass because the needle is seated. So let's just try that. I cannot blow any air in there. We test this theory out by just lifting the needle off the seat and trying again. Hopefully you can hear a little hissing there, so the air does pass through. It's like playing a little instrument. No, not at all. But that's blowing air through the needle that's held in place just by the weight of this, and that's not really how this works. This works by the buoyancy of this float, and I don't want fuel leaking out of this again. So I'm going to test it with an actual fluid, a liquid fuel substitute. I'm going to use mineral spirits. I'm going to put it in there and make a little test basin and try to test this out before we actually put it on the car. Let's see how that works. Okay, so here's my idea on how to do a little test on this needle and seat. I have a container, and suspended on this container is the top of the float bowl with the float needle and seat apparatus installed in a level fashion, just like it would be in the carburetor. I'm going to fill this reservoir with mineral spirits until this float just seats the needle. Then I'm going to inject into the fuel inlet using this 60 cc Toomey syringe mineral spirits, and if the needle is seated, I shouldn't be able to inject it easily, and this fuel pressure line, which is teed in here, should begin to read fuel pressure, or the equivalent of a fuel pressure. The Corvair fuel pump allegedly develops 5 pounds per square inch of pressure, but these Corvairs typically run better apparently on 2. So some people use pressure step-down regulators, or if not, then a return line from the fuel filter to the tank to reduce that fuel pressure. But if it holds, reasonably up to 5 psi, then that should be a good test. So let's give it a go. The mineral spirits are just about to start lifting the float, so I'm going to add a little bit more. Get to where the needle just seats. It's not quite seated. Let's say it's just barely seated. Let's see how that works. Okay, I'm going to start injecting. There, now the fluid is starting to flow. I'm going to top off a little bit more. It's definitely seated. Let's go ahead and inject. No flow, positive pressure. Right at 2, it starts popping off though. At this float setting at about 2 psi, it starts to break through, so I'm going to add a little bit more. Get a little more buoyancy, a little more force on the needle. Let's see how a little bit shot out of there. Released our pressure. Let's go ahead and pressure up again. Now
2, no flow. Starting to flow. But you know, it's coming out of this junction here. So, but not the needle. To 4 psi. psi, and that's the fuel pump pressure, and it's only leaking out of the connection. I wasn't able to tighten this whole thing down because it interfered with that, so that's flowing out of here, not out of the needle in the seat. It is holding, and we'll see it release. So I think this needle and seat has been demonstrated to maintain appropriate fuel stoppage at about 5 psi. I don't think it's going to leak fuel when we install it.
Last steps are put the fuel bowl lid on. Also forgot to put this little deal on the metering rod. So let's take care of that right now. Okay. It's on there. Got our gasket on. She's all buttoned up.
She's all buttoned up indeed. We put her back in the car, and I don't want to spoil anything from the last video because I know you're going to watch it. But the carburetor did seem to perform pretty well. It certainly didn't leak fuel everywhere. That's it for this one. I'll see you next time. We're going to try to get this thing back on the road. Y'all take care.